Artifact number 242, the Silver Compass. Its story is one of promises made and promises broken. Beneath layers of stone and silence lies the Keeper's Vault, a sanctuary for the forgotten and the forbidden. Here, artifacts of untold power are sealed away, each a fragment of a story written in folly and regret. They are not mere objects, but echoes of lives undone, reminders of choices that demanded too great a price. Among them rests the Silver Compass, its needle forever fixed, not to the familiar north, but to a path that should never be followed. Today, we uncover its tale. At a glance, it seems a relic of another time, its tarnished silver surface and faintly worn etchings offering little more than age-old craftsmanship. Its needle does not point north. It moves with purpose, drawn not to the poles, but to the desires buried deepest in the hearts of those who hold it. Wealth, freedom, answers. Yet the path it reveals is no gift. To follow this compass is to step into a journey that tempts with promise but seals with fate. Many have held it, believing themselves its master, only to discover the truth. The compass chooses its bearers, and the price is never what they expect. This is the story of James, a man who followed its pull, unaware of where it would lead. The sound of rushing water echoed softly through the barren valley as James sat on a weathered rock staring at the creek. His pan, discarded beside him, lay empty once again. The light of the afternoon sun danced mockingly across the water's surface, its deceptive beauty concealing the harsh truth. There was no gold here. James's hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet frustration that gnawed at him with every passing day. Weeks of relentless work had yielded nothing. His back ached from endless crouching, his fingers raw and blistered from gripping tools that seemed determined to betray him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let out a slow, measured breath. The thought of returning to town empty-handed made his stomach twist. What would he say to the others? That he'd failed, just as they had predicted? That the dream that had carried him this far had been a fool's errand? He thought of home, of the farm he had left behind, the dirt beneath his father's boots, the endless toil that seemed to yield only enough to scrape by. James had promised himself that he wouldn't live like that he'd find something better. Gold had been his answer, a way out, a way to prove he was more than the life he'd been born into. But now, sitting here in this desolate stretch of wilderness, the dream felt further away than ever. A flicker of light caught his eye. Something metallic glinted faintly beneath the roots of a toppled tree. James stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and crouched by the water's edge. With trembling fingers, he brushed away the dirt and pulled the object free. It was a compass, tarnished but intact, its silver surface etched with strange curling symbols. The needle quivered, but not in the way he expected. It didn't point north. Instead, it trembled, wavering for a moment, before fixing itself in a direction that seemed arbitrary. James turned it over in his hand, frowning at the markings. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was an oddity, no doubt left behind by someone long gone. Yet as he stared at the needle, a strange sensation tugged at him. He slipped the compass into his pocket, shaking his head as he stood. It was just a trinket, nothing more. That night, as James sat by his campfire, the compass lay beside him. The flames danced across its surface, the etchings seeming to shimmer in the shifting light. He picked it up, turning it over again, his thumb tracing the symbols. The needle hadn't moved since he'd found it, still pointing toward the forest's edge. He told himself it was meaningless, but the pull it exerted was undeniable. His eyes wandered to the barren hills behind him. He'd followed every map, panned every promising creek, and scoured every rumor he'd heard. Nothing had worked. His tools had failed him. His instincts had failed him. But the compass felt different. It wasn't just pointing a direction. It felt alive, deliberate, as if it knew something he didn't. James wrestled with the thought. To follow it meant abandoning the known, venturing into uncharted wilderness with no guarantee of return. But staying meant giving up. It meant admitting failure. He tightened his grip on the compass, his jaw set. The needle didn't waver. By morning, the decision was made. The first steps into the forest were tentative. James had spent years in the wild, but this place felt different. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of moss and earth. The trees stretched impossibly high, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered golden streaks. At first, the journey felt almost peaceful. The compass pointed forward, its needle steady, and James moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The forest seemed alive, but not in the way he was used to. It was quieter, the usual chatter of birds and rustle of leaves replaced by an almost reverent stillness. As the hours turned to days, the forest began to shift. Trails disappeared, swallowed by the underbrush. The trees grew denser, their roots snaking across the ground like veins. Landmarks appeared, strange stones carved with symbols like those on the compass, a creek that flowed uphill, a tree that seemed to bleed dark sap. James tried to rationalize it all, but the unease gnawing at him was harder to ignore. The compass was his only constant. Its needle never faltered, pulling him forward even as the forest seemed determined to hold him back. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged bursts, and his food supply dwindled to crumbs. But still, he pressed on. On the fifth day, or maybe it was the sixth, James stumbled into a clearing. The transition was so sudden that he froze, his heart pounding. The forest's oppressive darkness gave way to open sky, the sunlight flooding the space in a warm golden glow. For a moment, James simply stood, blinking against the brightness. Then he saw it. Gold. Veins of it ran through the earth, thick and glimmering, as if the ground itself had split open to reveal its heart. James dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as they sifted through the soil. It was real. He laughed, a sound that echoed raw and unrestrained through the clearing. The compass had led him here, to this, more wealth than he had ever dared to imagine. His exhaustion forgotten, James grabbed his pickaxe and began to dig. Every swing of the blade uncovered more of the glittering metal, his mind racing with visions of what it all meant. He saw himself returning to town, his pack brimming with gold. He saw the looks on their faces, the disbelief, the envy. He saw a house, a life free of struggle, a future that sparkled as brightly as the treasure before him. Hours passed. The shadows in the clearing grew longer, but James didn't notice. His arms ached, his hands raw and bleeding, but he kept digging. The pile of gold beside him grew, each nugget a promise of a life transformed. It wasn't until the light began to fade that James finally stopped. He straightened slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The clearing was quiet now, the forest stillness more oppressive than ever. He turned, looking for the path he had taken. It was gone. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks forming an unbroken wall around the clearing. James's chest tightened. He stumbled to the edge, his hands pressing against the bark, but there was no way through. The forest had closed in, trapping him. He grabbed the compass, shaking it violently. The needle didn't move. It lay lifeless in his hands, its pull gone, its purpose fulfilled. James sank to the ground, clutching a nugget of gold in one hand and the compass in the other. The realization settled over him like a weight he couldn't lift. The gold meant nothing now. It was beautiful, yes, but useless. A treasure with no value in a prison with no escape. As the last light of day faded, James sat motionless, the shadows of the forest creeping closer. The compass lay silent beside him, its needle trembling faintly, waiting for the next to follow. Failure can feel incredibly heavy. For James, it wasn't just about gold, it was about escape. The silver compass offered what seemed like salvation, a clear direction, a promise of something more. But promises like these are rarely honest. It didn't guide him to freedom, it led him deeper into the desires he couldn't escape, wrapping his desperation in the glint of golden light. The compass doesn't show you what you need, it reflects what you think you want, feeding on that longing until it becomes inescapable. For James, it meant wealth, but also isolation, a prison built from his own hopes. Artifacts like this are warnings. They teach us that running from failure only leads us further from purpose. True fulfillment isn't found in shortcuts or illusions. It's forged in the struggle to confront what we fear most. The silver compass now rests securely within the vault, its needle still and its power contained. Among the countless artifacts housed here, it stands as a reminder of the dangers that lie in promises too tempting to question and paths too easy to follow. But even locked away, its mystery persists. Who created such an object, and why? Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain unanswered, their truths as elusive as the compass's final destination.